I never thought shoveling snow for my neighbors would turn into a full-blown war, but that's exactly what happened. It started with the best of intentions and ended with lawyers, a forensic accountant, and an emergency town hall meeting that felt more like a public trial. My name is Mark, and for 15 years, I've lived in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet subdivision where people mostly kept to themselves but were always ready with a friendly wave or a helping hand. I own a small landscaping and snow removal business, so when the snow flies, I'm usually the first one out, not just for my clients, but for my own street. It's just what you do. Our neighborhood was governed, if you could call it that, by a homeowners association that had been mostly dormant for years. It existed on paper, collecting a modest annual fee to cover mowing the small common area near the entrance and maintaining the welcome sign. The meetings were poorly attended, usually just a handful of old-timers rubber-stamping the same budget year after year. It was a benign, toothless entity, and that's how we liked it. It kept the property value stable without anyone getting too involved in anyone else's business. It was the perfect balance of community and privacy. That all changed when Brenda moved in. She bought the corner lot 2 years ago, a retired regional manager from some faceless corporation, and she brought her corporate mindset with her. She saw our sleepy HOA not as a formality, but as an underutilized asset, a tool for imposing order. Within 6 months, she'd attended every meeting, volunteered for every position, and, through sheer, relentless persistence, got herself elected president of the board. No one else wanted the job, so we all just shrugged and let it happen. It was a mistake that would come to haunt us all. The changes started small, almost laughably so. First came the newsletter, a glossy, 4-page affair filled with passive-aggressive reminders about bylaws no one had read in a decade. Then came the enforcement. A notice on Mrs. Gable's door because her garden gnome was, according to a newly unearthed clause, an unapproved lawn fixture, a warning to the Peterson family for leaving their basketball hoop at the end of their driveway. The rules were petty, focusing on aesthetics and a rigid, sterile uniformity. Trash cans couldn't be visible from the street except for a 12-hour window on collection day. Holiday decorations had a strict installation and removal deadline. Each new rule, each new enforcement action, was a small tightening of a knot around the neighborhood's neck. People grumbled, but no one wanted to be the one to challenge Brenda. She had an inexhaustible supply of energy for confrontation, and most of us just wanted to come home from work and live in peace. The winter that year was brutal. It started with a series of respectable snowfalls, but then the big one hit. The weather forecasters called it a once-in-a-generation blizzard. For 3 days, the snow just didn't stop. When it was all over, we were buried under nearly 3 feet of heavy, wet powder. The city plows were overwhelmed, focusing on main arteries and emergency routes. Our little network of residential streets was completely impassable. For me, this wasn't a crisis, it was just another Tuesday, albeit a big one. I fired up my F-250 with a heavy-duty plow on the front, the same truck I used for my commercial contracts, and got to work. I started with my own driveway, then cleared a path down the center of our cul-de-sac. I saw my neighbor, George, a retiree in his late 70s, struggling with a snowblower that was clearly no match for the depth. I finished his driveway for him, and he gave me a grateful wave from his front window. I kept going. I cleared a path to the mailbox cluster, then made a pass in front of every driveway on the street, ensuring everyone could at least get out if they needed to. I spent the better part of 5 hours clearing our entire section of the neighborhood. It was hard work, but satisfying. People emerged from their homes, shovels in hand, to clear the berms I'd left, shouting thanks and offering me hot coffee. It felt like a community coming together. It was exactly the kind of thing that made Willow Creek a good place to live. The next morning, as I was enjoying a well-deserved cup of coffee and watching the neighborhood slowly come back to life, there was a sharp, insistent pounding on my front door. Not a friendly knock. A summons. I opened it to find Brenda standing on my cleared porch, clipboard in hand, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She was bundled in a pristine designer parka that looked like it had never seen a snowflake before that day. "Mark," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. "We need to talk about your unauthorized activity yesterday." I blinked, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Unauthorized activity? You mean the snow removal? I was just helping everyone get dug out. You were operating unlicensed heavy machinery on common property without board approval, she stated, as if reading from a script. Furthermore, the HOA has an exclusive contract with a certified and insured snow removal service. Your actions have put the entire community at legal and financial risk. I almost laughed. It was too absurd. Brenda, the certified service is nowhere to be seen. People were trapped. Mr. Henderson down the street has a heart condition. What if he needed an ambulance? I have a $2 million liability policy for my business. I think we're covered. Her eyes narrowed. She was not a person who appreciated logic when it interfered with her authority. That is irrelevant. Your personal insurance does not indemnify the homeowners association. According to Section 11, subsection C of the bylaws, any modification or maintenance of common areas must be performed by a board-approved vendor. You are not on that list. This was the moment the absurdity curdled into anger. Brenda, it's a snowstorm. It's what neighbors do. Are you seriously going to write me up for helping people? I am issuing you a formal warning, she said, tapping her clipboard with a gloved finger. And a special assessment fine of $500 to cover potential damages to the curbs and asphalt, which were not inspected prior to your unauthorized plowing. She slid a piece of paper out from under the clip. It was an official-looking violation notice, complete with the HOA logo she'd designed. If you engage in this activity again, the fines will increase, and a lien will be placed against your property. Have a good day. She turned and marched down my perfectly cleared walkway without another word, a petty tyrant surveying her conquered territory. I stood in the doorway, the cold air seeping into the house, holding the ridiculous piece of paper. $500. For helping my neighbors. The warning wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. A line had been drawn, not in the snow, but in the very fabric of our community. And I, quite accidentally, had just plowed right over it. I knew then that this wasn't going to end with a single fine. This was just the beginning. For the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood was a mess. The official HOA contracted plow service, a company called Executive Snow Solutions, was a complete no-show. The city plows eventually made a single pass down the main road, but our side streets and cul-de-sacs remained treacherous, packed down into a lumpy, icy wasteland by the cars that tried to force their way through. Mail delivery became sporadic. A school bus got stuck, and the district temporarily suspended service to our part of the subdivision. Mr. Henderson's visiting nurse had to park 3 blocks away and hike in through the snow. Meanwhile, the violation notice sat on my kitchen counter, a constant, irritating reminder of Brenda's overreach. I had no intention of paying it. It was a matter of principle. A week after she issued it, a second envelope arrived. This one was from a law firm, a formal demand letter stating that the fine was now overdue and had accrued interest. The total was now $575. The letter mentioned the lien again, a legal tool of intimidation that felt wildly disproportionate. My neighbors were sympathetic, but quiet. George called to thank me again, his voice low and conspiratorial. She's out of her mind, Mark, he said. Everyone thinks so. But nobody wants to get on her bad side. You see what she's doing to you. He was right. People were afraid. Brenda had successfully created a climate of fear, where the potential hassle of fighting back outweighed the injustice of her rules. I was the test case. If she could make an example of me, no one else would ever dare to step out of line. The passive-aggressive actions escalated. I received another violation notice, this time for my work truck being parked in my driveway for more than 24 hours. It was a commercial vehicle, she claimed, which was prohibited. I had parked that truck in the same spot for 15 years. It was absurd, a clear pattern of harassment. The fine was another $250. The letters were piling up, each one more threatening than the last. I realized I was in over my head. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore, it was a legal battle. I decided it was time to seek professional help. I found a lawyer, a man named David Chen, who specialized in real estate and HOA law. He had a small, cluttered office downtown, and he listened patiently as I laid out the whole story, spreading the violation notices and threatening letters across his desk. He reviewed the documents, nodding slowly. "This is classic," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a petty tyrant on a power trip. These kinds of HOA board presidents are more common than you'd think. They get a little taste of authority and it goes straight to their heads. So what can I do?" I asked. "Can I just refuse to pay?" "This is insane." "You can," David said, "but they can and will place a lien on your house. To fight it, you'd have to take them to court, which is expensive and time-consuming. And a judge might still side with them. HOA bylaws are a form of contract. When you bought your house, you agreed to them. Brenda's interpretation is aggressive, but she might be technically within her rights on some of these things." My heart sank. "So I just have to bend the knee and pay her ridiculous fines?" "Not necessarily," David said, a slight smile on his face. "We don't have to fight her on her turf. We need to change the battlefield. The best way to fight an HOA is from the inside. We need to look at the one thing that holds them accountable, their own rules and their finances." He explained that under state law, as a homeowner, I had the right to inspect the association's records. All of them. Financial statements, meeting minutes, contracts, everything. "She's stonewalling you with the bylaws," he said. "Let's see how well she's been following them herself." Leaving his office, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a frustrated resident, I was an investigator. My annoyance had transformed into cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my own sake anymore. I was fighting for Mr. Henderson, for the Gables and their garden gnome, for every family who just wanted to live their lives without being harassed. My first move was to draft a formal, legally sound request for documents, using a template David had provided. I asked for the last 3 years of financial records, including bank statements, the general ledger, all vendor contracts, and the minutes from every board meeting. I sent it via certified mail to the HOA's official address, which was, of course, Brenda's house. The little green receipt that came back a few days later was my proof that she had received it. The bylaw stipulated that the board had 10 business days to respond to such a request. For 9 days, there was silence. I could almost feel her fuming, trying to figure out a way to deny my request. On the 10th day, the final day, an email arrived. It was from Brenda. It was curt and dismissive. "The board is in receipt of your request," it read. "The documents are currently under review and will be made available at the board's earliest convenience." It was a classic stall tactic, and David had warned me about it. Earliest convenience was a meaningless phrase. I immediately had David send a follow-up letter from his office, reminding her of the legal deadline and citing the specific state statute she was now violating. The letter hinted at potential legal action against the board members personally if they continued to obstruct. That got their attention. 2 days later, I received another email, this one slightly more panicked in tone. I was informed that I could come to her house the following Saturday for 1 hour to review the documents in her presence. I was not allowed to make copies or take photographs. It was another attempt to control the situation, to make the process as difficult as possible. But it was a concession. She was giving me access. That Saturday, I walked up to her door feeling like I was heading into a deposition. She led me to her dining room, where a single cardboard box sat on her polished table. The air was thick with tension. She sat opposite me, arms crossed, watching my every move. The box was a disorganized mess of loose receipts, bank statements, and printouts. It was clear she'd just dumped everything in there. She was hoping I'd be overwhelmed and find nothing. I started methodically, page by page, using my phone to take notes. I focused on the biggest expenses first. And that's when I found it. The contract for Executive Snow Solutions. My jaw tightened as I read the terms. The HOA was paying them a flat rate of $15,000 for the winter season. $15,000. For a service they had never once provided. It was an astronomical sum for a neighborhood our size. A competitive bid would have been a third of that, at most. I kept digging. I looked at the invoices. They were being paid monthly, whether it snowed or not. Then I found the checks. I cross-referenced the check numbers with the bank statements. The checks were being cashed, but something was off. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for the company's address listed on the contract. It wasn't a commercial lot with a fleet of trucks. It was a private residence in a neighboring town. Curious, I did a property record search on the address. My blood ran cold. The owner of the property was listed as Gerald Peterson. Brenda's maiden name was Peterson. Gerald was her brother. It all clicked into place. The no-show close, the exorbitant contract, her obsessive rage when I did the job for free. I wasn't just interfering with her authority, I was interfering with her grift. She had awarded a fraudulent, wildly overpriced contract to her brother's shell company, and they were pocketing the money. Our money. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the leverage. This was more than just breaking the rules, this was fraud. Embezzlement. I tried to keep my face neutral, carefully placing the documents back on the table as if they were nothing special. I knew I couldn't take pictures, but I had memorized the key details, the contract amount, the company name, her brother's name. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's been very informative," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "Thank you for your time." I walked out of her house and straight to my truck. As I drove away, I saw her watching me from the window. She thought she had won. She thought she had intimidated me by letting me see a pile of paper. She had no idea she had just handed me the weapon that would bring her entire reign crashing down. My strategy shifted immediately from defense to offense. I called David the moment I got home and told him everything. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mark," he said finally, his voice a mix of shock and professional excitement, "this is a game changer. This isn't just about your fines anymore. This is a potential criminal case. We have to handle this carefully." He advised me against going straight to the police. An accusation of fraud without irrefutable proof could open me up to a defamation lawsuit. Brenda would claim it was a family coincidence, that she had recused herself from the vote, that it was all above board. We needed more than just a property record search. We needed to prove intent and a pattern of deception. The new plan was twofold. First, we needed to get our hands on official copies of those documents. Second, we needed to galvanize the community. Brenda's power came from our collective apathy and fear. It was time to change that. The first part was tricky. David drafted another legal letter, this time requesting copies of specific documents, citing a provision for homeowners to receive copies for a reasonable fee. We specifically asked for the Executive Snow Solutions contract and all related invoices and proofs of payment. We knew she would likely refuse, but her refusal itself would be evidence of wrongdoing. As expected, she replied that copying was not permitted on site and the board would have to vote on releasing official copies at the next quarterly meeting, which was months away. Another stall tactic, but we had her on record obstructing a legitimate request. The second part of the plan required a more delicate touch. I started talking to my neighbors, one-on-one. I started with George. I laid out what I had found, without making direct accusations. I simply stated the facts. "George, I saw the snow contract. We're paying a company $15,000 a season. The company is registered to an address owned by Brenda's brother. And they've never shown up. Not once." George, a retired accountant, whistled low. 15 grand? For nothing? That's grand larceny, is what that is. He was in. His quiet support turned into active partnership. He knew everyone in the neighborhood, and his word carried weight. We started a quiet campaign, going door to door, not with flyers and petitions, but with simple conversations. We told people about the contract. We asked them if they were satisfied with the services they were receiving for their HOA dues, which Brenda had, of course, raised by 20% when she took over. The reaction was a slow burn, then a wildfire. People who had been annoyed by the petty rules were incensed by the financial betrayal. The $15,000 wasn't an abstract number. It was their money. It was the reason their dues had gone up. It was money that could have been spent on fixing the cracked pavement or planting new trees, things that actually improved the neighborhood. The anger that had been simmering under the surface now had a focus. We needed a platform, a way to bring everyone together. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following month in the community clubhouse. It was usually a dull affair, but this year, it was going to be the main event. George and I worked the phones, sent emails, and talked to people in their driveways. We made sure everyone knew what was at stake. We urged them to attend. For the first time in years, people were actually planning to go to the HOA meeting. A few days before the meeting, I got another letter from the HOA's lawyer. It was a final demand for payment of my accumulated fines, which had now ballooned to over $1,000. The letter stated that if payment was not received within 48 hours, a property lien would be filed without further notice. It was a last-ditch effort to intimidate me, to silence me before the meeting. I looked at the letter and smiled. It was a worthless threat now. Brenda thought she was cornering me, but she was the one who was trapped. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen it so full. Every chair was taken, and people were standing along the walls and in the back. The usual attendance of 10 or 15 people had swelled to over 100. Brenda and the other two board members, a quiet man named Frank and a woman who always seemed to agree with whatever Brenda said, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Brenda looked flustered by the crowd, but she quickly composed herself, a tight, forced smile on her face. She opened the meeting with her usual procedural nonsense, reading the minutes from the last meeting and giving a long, self-congratulatory president's report about her various aesthetic enforcement successes. The tension in the room was palpable. People were shifting in their seats, whispering to each other. They weren't here for a lecture on lawn gnomes. Finally, she opened the floor for new business. This was our moment. George stood up first. "Brenda," he said, his voice calm and steady, "a number of us have some questions about the association's finances, specifically the contract for snow removal services." Brenda's smile vanished. "That falls under operational expenditures, which were approved in the annual budget," she said dismissively. "If you have a specific question, you can submit it in writing to the board." "I have a specific question right now," I said, standing up. All eyes in the room turned to me. "My question is, why is this community paying $15,000 to a company called Executive Snow Solutions, a company that has not once performed the service they were contracted for?" A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's face flushed a deep red. "That is a baseless accusation. Executive Snow Solutions is our official vendor. Any failure to perform is a matter between them and the board, and I assure you, we are handling it." "Handling it how?" I pressed. "By continuing to pay their invoices?" "I'd also like to know what the bidding process was for that contract. Were other bids solicited? And were you aware that the company is registered to your brother, Gerald Peterson?" The room erupted. The whispers turned into outraged shouts. "Her brother? 15,000? This is theft!" Brenda banged a small gavel on the table, but the noise was lost in the chaos. "Order! This is a private family matter. I recused myself from the vote. This is a slanderous personal attack." "Then show us the proof," someone yelled from the back. "Show us the other bids. Show us the minutes from the meeting where you recused yourself." Of course, she couldn't. Because none of it existed. The other two board members looked horrified. Frank, the quiet man, looked pale, as if he was about to be sick. He had clearly just been a rubber stamp, signing whatever Brenda put in front of him without asking questions. I held up my hand for quiet. "There's more," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "While our streets were impassable, I cleared them myself. I did it for free, to help my neighbors. And for that, Brenda fined me over $1,000 and threatened to put a lien on my home. She wasn't just failing to do her job, she was actively punishing someone who was doing it for her." That was the final blow. The anger in the room solidified into a single, unified purpose. George stood up again. "I'd like to make a motion," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board president, and I move to freeze all association accounts pending a full, independent forensic audit." Hands shot up all over the room. The vote was nearly unanimous. Brenda sat there, stunned into silence, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief. Her authority had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. The meeting devolved into a controlled sort of chaos as people organized, signing a petition for the immediate removal of the board and volunteering for a temporary oversight committee. Brenda, realizing she had lost completely, gathered her papers, stood up, and stormed out of the clubhouse without another word. The crowd parted to let her pass, a silent, damning indictment of her failed leadership. As the door slammed shut behind her, a spontaneous cheer went up in the room. It wasn't a cheer of victory, but of relief. The reign of the petty tyrant was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The temporary committee, with David Chen's legal guidance, immediately took control. They froze the HOA bank accounts and hired a forensic accountant. The accountant's report, which came back a few weeks later, was damning. It confirmed everything I had suspected and more. Not only was the Snow contract fraudulent, but Brenda had been using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, gas, groceries, even a spa day she'd disguised as a board retreat. The total amount of embezzled and misappropriated funds was over $22,000. Armed with this irrefutable proof, the committee didn't just remove her from the board, they took the accountant's report directly to the district attorney's office. A criminal investigation was launched. Brenda was formally charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The sheer weight of the evidence, the cancelled checks to her brother, the credit card statements, the fraudulent contract, was overwhelming. Her case went to trial 6 months later. I was called as a witness, as was George and the forensic accountant. I simply recounted the story on the stand, the snowstorm, the fines, my investigation, and the discoveries I made in her dining room. Brenda sat at the defendant's table, a diminished figure, her arrogance replaced by a sullen, bitter resentment. She had pleaded not guilty, her defense being that it was all a series of terrible misunderstandings and bookkeeping errors. The jury didn't buy it for a second. They were out for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge was not lenient. In his sentencing remarks, he spoke about the profound breach of trust. She hadn't just stolen money, she had preyed upon her own neighbors, exploiting their trust for personal gain. He sentenced her to 18 months in state prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the Homeowners Association, plus all legal fees. A lien was placed on her house. The very weapon she had tried to use against me was now being used against her to ensure we got our money back. With Brenda gone, the transformation in the neighborhood was incredible. All the fines she had issued against me and others were, of course, immediately dropped and expunged from the record. The temporary committee, which I reluctantly agreed to advise, drafted a new set of simplified, common-sense bylaws. The oppressive rules about garden gnomes and trash cans were abolished. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to genuine community enhancement. We hired a legitimate, local landscaping company, not mine, to avoid any conflict of interest, to handle the grounds and snow removal for a fair price. The HOA meetings became collaborative and productive. People started talking to each other again. The climate of fear was replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness. We even organized a neighborhood barbecue that summer, the first one in years. It felt like we had taken our community back. My reputation, far from being tarnished, was restored. People no longer saw me as a troublemaker, but as the guy who had stood up for all of them. I was hailed as a hero, which was always a bit uncomfortable for me. I never wanted to be a leader, I just wanted to be left alone to plow snow and help my neighbors. About 2 years after the trial, I had a final, strange encounter with Brenda. She had served her time and had been forced to sell her house to pay the restitution. I was in a grocery store in the next town over when I saw her in the produce aisle. She looked older, smaller. The hard shell of self-righteous authority was gone, replaced by something weary and defeated. She saw me, and for a moment, I could see the panic in her eyes. She started to turn her cart away, but then stopped. She walked over to me, avoiding my gaze. "Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I looked at her, and I didn't feel anger or even satisfaction. I just felt a sort of detached pity. She had thrown away her reputation, her freedom, and her home, all for a little bit of power and a few $1,000s. "I appreciate that, Brenda," I said. "I hope you can get things back on track." There was nothing else to say. The battle was long over. I nodded, and she walked away, disappearing into the next aisle. That was the last I ever saw of her. The chapter was finally, truly closed. Looking back on it all now, the whole ordeal seems like a bizarre fever dream. It's a stark reminder of how easily a community can be poisoned by one person's hunger for control, and how quickly people will surrender their own peace for an easy life. But it's also a story about the power of standing up, of asking questions, and of fighting back. The petty tyrant only has as much power as you're willing to give them. When pushed, the quiet, reasonable people in our neighborhood discovered a strength they didn't know they had. Today, Willow Creek Estates is more of a community than it ever was. The HOA is a tool for good, funding neighborhood events and making tangible improvements. Property values have not just recovered, they've soared, because it's known as a friendly, well-managed, and cooperative place to live. The story of the Blizzard Rebellion, as some of the old-timers jokingly call it, has become a part of our local lore, a cautionary tale told to new residents. And me? I'm back to doing what I do best. This morning, a fresh blanket of snow covered the ground. I fired up my old Ford F-250, the plow blade scraping reassuringly against the asphalt. As I cleared the street, just as I had all those years ago, my neighbors came out. But this time, they weren't just waving. George brought me a thermos of hot coffee. Mrs. Gable handed me a plate of warm muffins. The Peterson kids built a snowman in their yard and cheered every time I made a pass. I was just a guy with a plow, helping out his neighbors. And in our little corner of the world, everything was exactly as it should be. The peace was real, earned through a conflict I never wanted but would never regret. We had our community back, stronger and more united than ever before.